All right. So this is the promised second part of Louisiana with lots of multimedia here and some video that I actually shot in New Orleans. So let's start with this bit of horrific news. So, you know, in the first part, we covered that Louisiana, which is already one of the most incarcerated states in America, which makes it one of the most incarcerated places on earth, just decided to pass a crime bill expanding incarceration. And part of that crime bill was bringing back the electric chair and lethal injection. So Louisiana has a beloved electric chair known as Gruesome Gertie that right now is in a museum but may come back into service. The big chair rests on a museum pedestal, the haunting centerpiece to a display on Louisiana's abundant history of state killing. She stands more than 5 feet tall and a yard from ankle cups to back, less chair than throne in polished oak, leather straps, and buckles. There's nothing electric about her until the head cover comes on. A sign introduces visitors with the name bestowed by prisoners, Gruesome Gertie. On a nearby wall are the faces of the last 20 men who sizzled to their deaths while belted in, slightly reclined. Once the object of death row nightmares, Louisiana's infamous electric chair is a relic of a time long past and come again. I'm going to tell you all a fun fact. You know why it's an electric chair? It was invented by a dentist from Buffalo. So he thought in terms of putting them in a chair for it.
Interesting.
Yeah, true story. Whether Gertie herself will be called out of retirement is a question that Louisiana corrections officials declined to answer last week after state lawmakers passed a bill including electrocution and nitrogen gas on a new menu of execution methods. On Thursday, a lone visitor approached Gruesome Gertie in silence, as most do, said Catherine Lokelt, director of the Tidy Museum outside the gates of the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Nobody really talks much about it, she said. It's kind of a somber thing. Do you think? A few hours earlier, lawmakers in Baton Rouge were hurling biblical passages across the Senate floor before the vote to add high voltage and gassing alongside a lethal drug cocktail. Landry sat in the gallery with loved ones of violent crime victims for the debate. If he signs it, and he did sign it, by the way, this is earlier, Louisiana will become the 9th state to make electrocution legal in at least some scenarios, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. Unlike elsewhere, Louisiana's pending law would leave the choice among those 3 execution methods to the state corrections secretary. A request for comment from Secretary Jimmy LeBlanc on his preference went unanswered. A Department of Corrections spokesperson declined to comment on logistics, referring questions to Landry's office, which did not respond Friday. Legal challenges like those that helped usher Gruesome Gertie into retirement 33 years ago after a half-century of on and off-again killing figure to keep things historical, at least for now. The chair hasn't been totally dormant, finding new life as a movie prop. Sean Diddy Combs, in happier times, settled into Gertie for the 2001 drama Monsters Ball. Foreshadowing, we call that in the business. In 1990, the prison magazine, The Angleite, published photos of burns over the body of Robert Wayne Williams, whose 1983 execution marked Gertie's return to the death row stage after 22 years. News reporters saw smoke rise from Williams' leg and temple, though a state expert later claimed it was vapor from the sponges placed under electrodes on the condemned man's head. Legal challenges helped pressure the pivot to lethal injection at a time when death row held 33 condemned prisoners, less than half its current population. During World War II, electrocution replaced the gallows in Louisiana, the latter having been deemed too barbaric. Gertie was built in the early 1940s to go mobile. modeled after a portable electric chair in Mississippi, according to news accounts. Tested on a goat, the chair came with a truck and a generator and traversed Louisiana under a law that required executions to be held in the parish where the crime was committed. According to a 1990 Angelite story, Gertie traveled 56 times from the prison in its first 15 years. The botched execution of teenager Willie Francis in 1946 may have contributed to a decision to keep the chair and its use inside the prison. Francis was 15 when he fatally shot Andrew Thomas, a druggist, on Main Street in St. Martinville and stole $4 and a watch a jury found. He was 16 when sentenced to death and 17 when the state first tried to kill him. Quote, I saw the executioner turn on the switch and I saw his lips puff out and swell. His body tensed and stretched. I heard the one in charge yell to the man outside for more juice when he saw that Willie Francis was not dying. And the one on the outside yelled back that he was giving him all he had. An official witness recounted in an affidavit in court records. Then Willie Francis cried out, take it off, let me breathe. Then they took the hood from his eyes and unstrapped him. The state called the problem a latent electrical defect, and an appeal based on the aborted execution failed. Francis received his punishment in 1947. Mobile executions ended 9 years later and the pace slowed. Between 1961 and 1983, when the state killed Williams, Louisiana held no executions, in part due to a moratorium the U.S. Supreme Court put in place in 1972. Another fun fact, that's the only reason that the Manson family did not get executed. They were originally sentenced to death.
Another fun fact, Russell wanted to open the live show with this story. I said, no, let's do it tonight. This is too much of a downer for the live audience show.
Not only did I want to do it for the live show, I wanted to do it while sitting in a facsimile of gruesome Gertie.
Yeah, he wanted to do props, and I said that's going to be too involved. It's too much of a downer. Let's just do it now. Yeah, this is you talk about fucked up. You talked about, there was a story very quickly. I won't take up too much time. I went to a surprise party for a family member on Saturday, and there's a guy there who's a sweet guy who says he listens to our show. I don't really believe him because if he did, he wouldn't like me as much as he does. He wouldn't like me as much as he does if he did. But he's a really nice guy. But he said, look, we have to vote for Biden. We have to save the country, and then we'll work towards.
Watch us. No.
But he said we have to save the country, and so this is like a story like this, among many others, among countless others. It seems nowadays, this is what brings out why I told Thomas Frank what I said. Fuck the country. Why do we have to save the country? Why? What is the moral case for saving this country from its inevitable fate? What is the moral case for investing in the betterment of this country on these terms? That's not to say you don't take care of each other. I'm for mutual aid. I'm for building a new system when this crumbles. What is the moral case that you can make when reading stories about this, when reading stories about shipping 2,000-pound bombs to Israel without the public knowing? At least they didn't want the public to know. Like, what is the moral case for redeeming a nation like this? None. I'm sorry, zero. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this story's going to reinforce your case before we're done. According to a 1985 story in the Los Angeles Times, the Angola warden at the time, Frank Blackburn, said he had to pull Gertie from his garage and hire electricians when the killing resumed. The wife wanted to paint it white and cut a hole in it for a plant. I wouldn't let her. Well, fortunately, he didn't, because they might need it again now. So, as you know, by kismet, I went to an event while I was in Louisiana. This, by the way, is the picture that sits in that museum across from the electric chair of the last 20 men killed in it. So I got to go to an incarceration event where a man that I didn't know at the time, but I did some research in preparation for this segment, a guy named Ted Kwan was speaking. And he's kind of a legend. This guy has been around fighting these kinds of causes for literally decades. He was, in 1982, he was on the National Coordinating Committee of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression with Angela Davis. And in 95, he was a founder of the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. But he spent most of his career at Loyola. So this is the committee there, and you can see Ozzie Davis was the chairman. So to give you an idea of how far back this fellow goes, this was in a documentary from 1981 called Resurgence. This is Ted Kwan here.
I'm telling you, there's a new Dred Scott decision in the land that says it's all right to murder blacks, that black people have no rights which whites are bound to respect. That is the political climate we're in. The right wing says, what they say about the minimum wage, when people don't have the money to make a decent living, they say that's a hindrance to full employment. There was no unemployment under slavery, right? So we can have full employment. Just put us back into slavery.
All right, so we're going to take a look at Ted Kwan now, or at least about a month ago that I actually got to meet him, talking about the 13th Amendment and the slave system that you have today in prisons, nowhere more so than in Louisiana.
Put a box greatly. The first speaker we have is someone that I really admire greatly, Mr. Ted Kwan, the former director of the Tomei Center for Peace Through Justice, right?
I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed right now with what's happening in this country, what's happening in our state. We're here talking about mass incarceration. The United States is the most incarcerated nation in the world, and Louisiana is the most incarcerated state in the United States. These laws that are filling the jails up with our people were passed when the Constitution changed because of the Civil War, and we had the 13th Amendment, and it said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, wherein the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. There will be no slavery in the United States or any place under its jurisdiction except as punishment for a crime for which someone has been duly convicted. Wow. The racists thought a chance. We'll make a law so we can control the situation, and that law will be the vagrancy law. Any person caught without, any black person, because white people didn't have to do it, that can't show where they worked or have money in their pocket, they could be charged with vagrancy, and they could be arrested and put in jail for vagrancy. And where do they put the jails? What parishes do the jails go into that increases their population by the number of prisoners there, and therefore also increases their political power, even though those people that give them the population can't vote or do anything with voting because they are prisoners? But the numbers of people is increased, therefore benefits and other things come there. Money comes there, jobs come there, and the politicians get to benefit from that to keep it going.
Speak some truth, said Kwan. Yeah.
And now this slavery, it says you can be enslaved if you are convicted of a crime. So these prisons are profit-making institutions. The jails where they're put gives jobs to people. Those jails where it's put are a benefit to those there at the expense of victims of this unjust system. Always, even when I was a child, I remember that. When a crime happened and it was bad, and the adults would say, I hope it wasn't a black man. I hope it wasn't a black man. Because if it was a black man, we are all convicted. If it was a white person, that's a white bad person. If it was a black person, that's black people. And then I remember when this man put a bomb under his mama's chair on a plane, passenger plane with 300 some people on it. Man took out insurance on his mother, put the bomb under her chair, and it blew up in the air, killing 300 and some people so he could collect the insurance on killing his mama. And I remember saying, I hope it wasn't a black man. And everybody looked at me like I was crazy. Ain't no black person gonna blow up his mama. That's some white folks
stuff. So that was Ted. I'd like to get him on the show. I was trying to get his contact information at the end. I must have written down the email wrong, but I got some other contacts that I'll reach out to that I'm sure know him. But just an amazing guy, still out there doing it. We have a lot of people in our space who already feel burnout, who have been going since 2016. Look at that cat. He's there back in the 70s.
Yep.
And he's still showing up.
Yep.
To
5
give
decades.
a speech about this. Wow, man. That is dedication. That is passion. And if you look him up, he's really done a lot of good work over the course of his life. It's a very interesting video I found of him. They talked a little bit about this at the event because you had a lot of people who were talking about the incarceration facilities of ICE that they have in Louisiana. And they were talking about how they get brought in and set against the black population. There was a guy there, he was brought in legally. He was brought in legally basically to do $6 an hour labor that they told him was going to be $16 an hour from, I think it was from Ecuador. And he said, they tell you, oh, the blacks are lazy. That's what they tell you to set the workers against each other. And he was saying, we didn't even know what the statue of General Lee was. We don't know that history. So there's a very interesting video of Ted Kwan with a translator standing at Lee's Circle when the statue was still there. They just removed it about 3 years ago. And he was giving a speech explaining what that statue was with the translator, explaining it to all of these immigrants who had been brought in to rebuild after Katrina. So that guy has just an amazing history, and God bless him for still having that passion to be showing up at a cafe like that on a Sunday afternoon to talk about this. But the things, and that, by the way, that's Cafe Istanbul. That place has the best poetry reading I've ever been to in my life on Wednesday nights. So if you're in New Orleans, check that place out. I love it. And the guy who runs it is amazing. So what he's talking about there, as our very smart audience probably knows, is the 13th Amendment, which gave an exception to slavery. It's essentially slavery, right? You can be forced into servitude for a crime. So what he's talking about there with vagrancy, I saw a couple people in the chat, not too many, saying, wow, white people can't be arrested for vagrancy? Sure, I'm sure some poor white people got caught up in the system. But mostly, let's get real, when you see those photos of the old chain gangs, it was mostly black people who got caught up that way. It was a way for them to maintain slavery. And I don't think it's a coincidence, I don't think anybody would say it's a coincidence, that as soon as you had the civil rights movement, made it no longer viable to just grab black people off the street for vagrancy, they started the war on drugs. And that gave them a new way to make sure that black people were incarcerated. In ways that I think a lot of us do not even realize, slavery never ended. This is something that's really been invisible to us. Slavery continued within the prisons under the auspices of the 13th Amendment. So for anybody who thinks this isn't a thing, AP just did a great report about this in January. I was actually talking to Robin McDowell about having her on the show One thing led to another. We were in communication, but it didn't happen. But I would like to get her on at some point and cover more of this article. I'm just going to cover a little bit of it so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So prisoners in the U.S. are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands. A hidden path to America's dinner tables begins here at an unlikely source, a former southern slave plantation that is now the country's largest maximum security prison. If you didn't know, Angola is a former plantation. I don't think they put the prison there by accident. Unmarked trucks packed with prison-raised cattle roll out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, where men are sentenced to hard labor and forced to work for pennies an hour or sometimes nothing at all. After rumbling down a country road to an auction house, the cows are bought by a local rancher and then followed by the Associated Press another 600 miles to a Texas slaughterhouse that feeds into the supply chains of giants like McDonald's, Walmart, and Cargill. Intricate, invisible webs just like this one link to some of the world's largest food companies and most popular brands to jobs performed by U.S. prisoners nationwide, according to a sweeping 2-year AP investigation into prison labor that tied hundreds of millions of dollars worth of agricultural products to goods sold on the open market. They are among America's most vulnerable laborers. If they refuse to work, some can jeopardize their chances of parole or face punishment like being sent to solitary confinement. They also are often excluded from protections guaranteed to almost all other full-time workers, even when they are seriously injured or killed on the job. The goods these prisoners produce wind up in the supply chains of a dizzying array of products found in most American kitchens, from Frosted Flakes cereal and ballpark hot dogs to Gold Medal flour, Coca-Cola, and Riceland rice. They are on the shelves of virtually every supermarket in the country, including Kroger, Target, Aldi, and Whole Foods. And some goods are exported, including to countries that have had products blocked from entering the U.S. for using forced or prison labor. Many of the companies buying directly from prisons are violating their own policies against the use of such labor, but it's completely legal, dating back largely to the need for labor to help rebuild the South's shattered economy after the Civil War. Enshrined in the Constitution by the 13th Amendment, slavery and involuntary servitude are banned except as punishment for a crime. That clause is currently being challenged on the federal level, and efforts to remove similar language from state constitutions are expected to reach the ballot in about a dozen states this year. Some prisoners work on the same plantation soil where slaves harvested cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane more than 150 years ago, with some present-day images looking eerily similar to the past. In Louisiana, which has one of the country's highest incarceration rates, men working on the farm line still stoop over crops stretching far into the distance. So to give you an idea of what brands we're talking about, all of those. All of those. And that is by no means an exhaustive list. You're getting that Valentine candy for your sweetie, Russell Stover, prison labor. Burger King, prison labor. Gold Medal flour, Rice Krispies, McDonald's, prison labor.
Cheerios. That's not good for the brand. Cheerios.
Yeah, breakfast of prisoners.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's horrible, and it's something I would like to point out. You know, we just had this Black Lives Matter moment, right? And something we've always mentioned is Black Lives Matter didn't really have a clear set of demands. It was very strange. It was very like the Women's March. It was a movement without a manifesto. And I don't think that's an accident that that's what was emphasized. That's what was elevated. And you heard very little about this. Slavery, right? It is the cardinal sin. It is the original sin of the nation. and it never ended. You should hear about this nonstop, and you don't because of these companies, because it would affect the economy. You can have a big cakewalk through the middle of D.C. They don't give a shit. It doesn't cost these companies a nickel. They love that. They love empty gestures. Now, the fact that this is on the ballot in a dozen states, and that is something I want to look into more. You know, people always ask, what can you do? What can you do? I mean, that sounds like a worthy cause. That sounds like something worth supporting. So that's something I want to look more into to see how we can support that effort. But we literally still have slavery under another name. While everybody's sitting here instigating slavery from the 1840s, we have slavery right now. It's not talked about nearly as much because it's going to affect people who make a lot of money from it today, right now. You want to talk about immigrants taking jobs at Tyson? Why don't you talk about prisoners taking jobs at Tyson? Because that's one of the companies there.
Well, it's also very difficult to organize any resistance against this. Why? Well, you could start from people who get out of prison often cannot vote. They can't vote, right?
Right.
So start right there. From the most victimized group, they are not only economically exploited as, yes, modern-day slaves, but they are then politically disenfranchised, which means it falls to people who don't have a record, who can vote, to organize resistance to that. And that is very difficult. It's very, very difficult to do because people, ordinary people, have, you know, this real chip on their shoulder about people who break the law, whether it is, you know, hating on immigrants for working at a meatpacking warehouse. I mean, we're going to do this story sometime this week. The net worth of the richest 1% in this country now is $44 trillion. $44 trillion is the net worth of the top 1%. The GDP of this country.
The people really fucking you are the immigrants getting paid $16.50 an hour to cut up meat.
The GDP of the country is $25 trillion, which means the richest 1% literally own this country almost twice over.
Yep.
And yet you have a hatred in your heart for the immigrant who's picking apart chicken carcasses for $16 an hour. That's not to say you can't be concerned about, you know,
wages,
the southern border,
sure,
and,
right,
you know, the effect on wages. But as we demonstrated there, Tyson would just as soon hire anybody who wants to work there. And they do hire people who come to work there. The issue there is turnover. It's extremely high turnover. So there's always going to be people who they need to fill those jobs. Right. Anyway, that's a different story, kind of. But part of the reason why it's very hard to organize for prison reform is because the people who are the most victimized by this ridiculous, awful, brutal, inhuman system we have are people who society deems unworthy of their political support, right? And that just appeals to base instincts among people. I was at a gathering and I overheard somebody say they're considering moving to Florida, relocating to Florida. Why? Not because of taxes, you know, not because of a lot of the reasons why old people leave New York for Florida, because of the stand your ground laws. Well, the stand your ground laws are better in Florida than they are here. So you're going to upend yourself and relocate on the off chance you have to shoot somebody who breaks into your house. That's really a reason to relocate down to a state? The fucking loser can't wait to put a bullet in someone's head. That's why he has to move down to Florida, right? Because he has a fantasy of shooting a home invader to make up for the fact that he hasn't been able to get a hard on in 15 years. Like, this is what you're dealing with. And, but it's true. It's true. The reason why
is much more likely to get that gun shoved up their ass.
Well, obviously. But this is the level of discourse that you're dealing with around issues like this. It's really hard to overcome this notion of who is worthy of support and who is not. And this is why I was extremely skeptical, to put it mildly, extremely critical when they started handing down these ridiculous sentences for the January 6th people, because I saw it as the same thing in action, just against a group that, you know, quote unquote liberal media sees as more deserving, even though you really can't say they see them as more. Like, have you heard CNN do a segment on this recently? Have you heard MSNBC do a segment on this recently? Does the media touch this story? No matter who the victims are.
Exactly.
But sentencing is out of control. Conditions of the prisons out of control. It's just, you think of how extreme a measure it is to lock someone in a cage. You keep them away from their family, away from society, right? Put a toilet bowl in the middle of a cell, and that's their life for as long as the state wants.
Yep.
And sometimes longer in Louisiana, as we did in part one of this little piece that we are doing here. Sometimes years longer. Like, how radical is it to do that to a human being?
Well, and this is another point. Our last Louisiana segment, got mixed reactions. Predictably, some people, very much took don't commit the crime if you can't do the time. And setting aside that a major part of that story was that a lot of these people do their time and then are not released, including one person who was kept 3 years past their sentence. I mean, can you imagine the injustice of that? You only get one life, man. Yeah. 3 years is a lot to take from a person. Yeah. But what this article gets into, and it's more in its fullness, is how profitable this is. And we touched on that last time too. These counties make a lot of money. You got these people, especially Louisiana, man. I mean, it's legendary for its political corruption. They had a case where a guy got sentenced to 10 years because his family benefited $1.4 million from this system. What do you think? He's the only one that's shoving money in their pockets? The AP article gets into how there are deficits all over the place in these systems that are unaccounted for. Of course, they're stealing this money. So when you have incarceration benefiting people economically, you're incentivizing the carceral state. It has nothing to do with preventing crime. If incarcerating people prevented crime, if that in and of itself was a panacea, why does Louisiana have some of the worst crime in the country and one of the highest incarceration rates? If that's going to fix it, they should have some of the lowest crime rates in the country. They have one of the highest levels of incarceration in the world, right? They should be almost crime-free. They should be like Japan there. So clearly that's not addressing it. So why do they keep addressing it from that angle? Because it's profitable. It's profitable. As long as you don't stop this, defund the fucking police all you want. They're going to keep finding reasons to lock people up because they're making money from it. Not just them. Some of the biggest, most powerful corporations in the world are making money from it. Until you address that, you are not going to be able to address mass incarceration.
Please clap.